By late September 1917, the city of Petrograd had descended into a state of nervous exhaustion. The long white nights of summer were gone, replaced by the grey, relentless rain of a Baltic autumn. The physical decay of the capital mirrored the political collapse of the Russian state. The municipal services had largely ceased to function. The streetlights remained dark at night due to a lack of fuel, leaving the boulevards wrapped in an ominous gloom. Heaps of uncollected rubbish piled up in the courtyards, and the crime rate soared as the police force, destroyed in the February uprising, left the streets to the mercy of armed gangs. The most pressing reality for the inhabitants was hunger. The bread ration, which had sparked the initial revolution 7 months earlier, had been cut again, this time to a mere £0.5 per person per day. Even that meagre amount was often unavailable. The queues outside the bakeries grew longer and more desperate, filled with people who had lost faith in every political party that promised them relief. Following the failure of General Kornilov's coup in August, the provisional government existed in name only. Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky still sat in the Winter Palace, sleeping in the bed of Tsar Alexander III, but his authority had evaporated. He issued decrees that no one read and gave orders that no one obeyed. He was a leader without an army, a socialist without the support of the workers, and a head of state whom the aristocracy viewed with contempt. He remained in the palace like a ghost, isolated in the vast, gold-leafed chambers, waiting for the inevitable end. Real power had shifted 3 miles to the east, to a building that sat on a bend in the Neva River. The Smolny Institute had formerly been a finishing school for the daughters of the nobility, a place of French lessons and curtsies. Now, its endless corridors were trampled by the muddy boots of soldiers and factory workers. The air, once perfumed, was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco smoke and wet wool. This was the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet. In the wake of the Kornilov affair, the political composition of the Soviet had transformed. The Bolsheviks, who had been a radical minority just weeks before, were now the dominant force. They had won the elections for the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets, riding a wave of popularity after organizing the defense of the capital against the military coup. They still held the 40,000 rifles that Kerensky had foolishly allowed them to distribute to the Red Guard. The atmosphere in October 1917 was fundamentally different from the chaotic, spontaneous explosion of February. There were no mass demonstrations filling the Nevsky Prospect. There was no jubilant shouting. Instead, there was a quiet, deadly calculation. The revolution had moved from the streets into the committee rooms. While the city shivered in the rain, men sat in secret meetings, consulting maps of the city's infrastructure. They were planning a military operation designed to seize control of a global empire with the precision of a surgeon. The time for speeches was over. The time for the mathematician of the revolution, Leon Trotsky, and the architect, Vladimir Lenin, had arrived. Part 1. The Art of Insurrection. In September 1917, the political landscape of Russia underwent a seismic shift that few in the provisional government fully appreciated until it was too late. In the wake of the Kornilov affair, the Bolshevik Party, which had been decimated and driven underground in July, experienced a complete resurrection. The failed military coup had vindicated their warnings. For months, the Bolsheviks had argued that the liberals and the generals were plotting to crush the working class. When General Kornilov actually marched on Petrograd and Prime Minister Kerensky was forced to arm the workers to stop him, the Bolshevik message suddenly resonated with the force of prophecy. The result was a landslide in the local elections. Throughout September, the Bolsheviks won majorities in the Soviets of both Petrograd and Moscow. This was the critical turning point. The slogan, "All power to the Soviets," was now a call for the Bolsheviks to become the government. The public face of this resurgence was Leon Trotsky. Released from the Kresty prison on September 4th, Trotsky immediately returned to the Smolny Institute. His popularity was immense. He was the finest orator of the revolution, capable of holding thousands of sailors and workers spellbound for hours in the drafty halls of the modern circus, which was used as a massive meeting venue. Trotsky was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, the exact same position he had held during the failed revolution of 1905. He was the voice and the visible leader of the rising tide. But the brain of the movement was still in hiding, hundreds of miles away in Finland. Vladimir Lenin watched these developments with a mixture of exhilaration and terrified impatience. From his safe houses in Helsinki and Viborg, he analyzed the reports reaching him from the capital. He saw a unique alignment of historical forces. The peasants were seizing land in the countryside, the army was mutinying at the front, and the urban workers were armed and radicalized. Lenin believed that this was a fleeting moment. He argued that the revolutionary wave had peaked. If the Bolsheviks did not act immediately, the wave would crash. The provisional government might sign a separate peace with Germany to free up troops to crush the rebels, or the winter might simply starve the revolution into submission. Throughout late September, Lenin bombarded the Central Committee in Petrograd with letters written in furious blue ink. His language was apocalyptic. He accused his own party leaders of passivity and cowardice. He wrote that waiting for the promised Constituent Assembly elections was a constitutional illusion. He demanded that the party prepare for an immediate armed insurrection. The Central Committee, sitting in the comfort of the Smolny Institute, was less enthusiastic. They were pragmatic men. They remembered the disaster of the July days when a premature uprising had nearly destroyed the party. They burned some of Lenin's letters, fearing that if the police found them, it would trigger another crackdown. They ignored his demands, telling him to stay in Finland for his own safety. Lenin realized that he could not direct a revolution by post. He decided to violate the orders of his own Central Committee and return to Petrograd. The journey was fraught with danger. The provisional government still had a warrant out for his arrest on charges of high treason. If he was caught at the border, he would likely be executed before he reached a jail cell. In the first week of October, Lenin underwent another transformation. He'd already shaved his iconic beard and mustache in July. Now he donned a wig and a pair of spectacles. He looked less like a revolutionary firebrand and more like a Lutheran pastor or an aging schoolteacher. He boarded a locomotive in Viborg, traveling in the cab with the engineer, Aino Raja, who acted as his bodyguard. He arrived in Petrograd on October 7th. He went straight into deep hiding, moving to an apartment in the Viborg district. He was now physically present in the capital, and his influence became impossible to ignore. He summoned the leadership of the party to a decisive meeting. The meeting took place on the night of October 10th, 1917. It is one of the most famous secret gatherings in political history. The location was the apartment of Nikolai Sukhanov, situated at number 32 Karpovka River Embankment. There was a heavy irony in the choice of venue. Nikolai Sukhanov was a prominent Menshevik, a political rival of the Bolsheviks. However, his wife, Galina Flaximan, was a committed Bolshevik. She had advised her husband that he should stay late at his office that night, ensuring the apartment would be empty. The conspiracy to overthrow the government was hatched in the home of one of its supporters without his knowledge. 12 members of the Central Committee gathered in the dining room. The atmosphere was tense. The curtains were drawn tight against the autumn rain. A samovar of tea sat on the table, surrounded by plates of sausage and bread. Lenin arrived late, wearing his wig and spectacles. For a moment, his closest comrades did not recognize him. When he removed his disguise, they saw a man who was physically diminished by months of hiding, but intellectually sharper than ever. Lenin took the floor and spoke for an hour. He was relentless. He laid out the case for immediate insurrection. He argued that the international situation was critical, with mutinies breaking out in the German Navy. He argued that the agrarian revolts in the Russian countryside proved the peasants were ready. He stated bluntly that the provisional government was a corpse that just needed to be pushed over. He attacked the wait-and-see attitude of the party leadership. He told them that history would not forgive them if they did not take power now. However, the room was not unanimous. Two of the most important figures in the party, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, pushed back violently. Zinoviev and Kamenev were Lenin's oldest lieutenants. They had been with him in exile for years. But that night, they stood up to him. They argued that Lenin was underestimating the strength of the government and overestimating the support for the Bolsheviks. Kamenev pointed out that while the workers in Petrograd might be with them, the rest of Russia was not. He warned that if they launched a coup, they would be isolated. The entire army, the peasantry, and the foreign powers would turn against them. They would be crushed by the sheer weight of the counter-revolution. He argued that they should wait for the Constituent Assembly elections, where the Bolsheviks were predicted to win a strong minority and then work within a coalition government. Zinoviev supported him. He argued that risking everything on a single roll of the dice was madness. He believed that the party was growing stronger every day and that time was on their side. Why risk suicide when they were winning the political battle? The debate raged for hours, lasting deep into the night. It was a clash between two fundamental visions of socialism. Kamenev and Zinoviev believed in a democratic path, a gradual transition to power. Lenin believed in the sudden, violent rupture, the seizure of the state by a disciplined vanguard. Lenin was furious with his old friends. He accused them of losing their nerve. He turned his ferocity on them, mocking their caution as parliamentary cretinism. At roughly 3 o'clock in the morning, the time came for a vote. It was a vote that would decide the fate of the 20th century. Lenin grabbed a piece of paper torn from a child's school notebook. He hastily scribbled a resolution. It stated that an armed uprising was inevitable and the time for it was fully ripe. 10 hands went up in favor of the resolution. They included Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and Alexandra Kollontai. 2 hands went up against it, Zinoviev and Kamenev. The motion passed 10-2. The meeting broke up just before dawn. The conspirators slipped out of the apartment one by one into the rainy Petrograd night. Lenin returned to his safe house. He had won the argument. The Bolshevik Party was now officially committed to overthrowing the provisional government by force of arms. However, the resolution was notably vague. It did not set a date or a specific plan of attack. It simply declared war. The what had been decided, but the how was still a mystery. This was where the division of labor between the two giants of the revolution became clear. Lenin was the strategist who provided the iron will and the theoretical justification. But he was still in hiding, unable to appear in public. The man who had to translate that will into action was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky realized that Lenin's idea of a classic coup, a sudden attack by the party militia, was dangerous. The soldiers of the Petrograd garrison might not fight for the Bolshevik Party. They were tired of politics. But, Trotsky reasoned, they would fight for the Soviet. Trotsky began to devise a masterstroke of political camouflage. He would not call for an insurrection, he would call for defense. He would argue that the provisional government was planning to abandon Petrograd to the Germans and that the Soviet needed to take control of the garrison to defend the capital. In the days following the secret meeting, Trotsky began to construct the machinery of the coup right under the nose of the government. He used his position as chairman of the Soviet to create a new organization, the Military Revolutionary Committee. Ostensibly, its purpose was to coordinate the defense of the city against the German army. In reality, it was the headquarters for the uprising. The Military Revolutionary Committee took over room number 10 on the top floor of the Smolny Institute. It became the nerve center of the coming storm. Trotsky dispatched commissars, political representatives, to every regiment in the city. These commissars carried a simple instruction: no orders from the provisional government were to be obeyed unless they were countersigned by the Military Revolutionary Committee. With this bureaucratic maneuver, Trotsky effectively severed the chain of command between Prime Minister Kerensky and his army. The coup had now begun with a piece of paper signed in a committee room. While Kerensky sat in the Winter Palace believing he was still in charge, the ground beneath his feet had already been bought and paid for by the men in the Smolny Institute. Part 2. The Military Revolutionary Committee. While Vladimir Lenin remained in hiding, firing off letters demanding an immediate uprising, the practical machinery of the revolution was being assembled in room 10 of the Smolny Institute. The man overseeing this operation was Leon Trotsky. Trotsky understood something that Lenin, in his isolation, perhaps missed. He understood the psychology of the soldier. The Petrograd garrison consisted of 150,000 men. These were war-weary peasants who had little interest in Marxist theory. If the Bolsheviks called for an armed coup to install a party dictatorship, the soldiers might hesitate. They might stay in their barracks, just as they had done during the suppression of the July days. However, the soldiers were fiercely loyal to the Petrograd Soviet, the elected council that they viewed as their own voice. Trotsky realized that for the insurrection to succeed, it had to be camouflaged. Trotsky found his opportunity in the paranoia of the moment. The German army was dangerously close to the capital. Rumors were circulating that the provisional government planned to abandon Petrograd to the enemy and move the capital to Moscow. Trotsky seized upon this fear. He argued that the government was preparing to surrender the revolutionary capital to the Kaiser to crush the working class. Therefore, the Soviet needed to create a body to supervise the defense of the city. On October 12th, the Soviet voted to establish the Military Revolutionary Committee, or MRC. On paper, the MRC was a multi-party organization dedicated to protecting the city from the Germans and from domestic counter-revolutionaries. In reality, it was a front for the Bolshevik military organization. Its president was a young socialist revolutionary named Pavel Lazimir, a choice Trotsky made deliberately to make the committee look less partisan. But the real power lay with the Bolsheviks who controlled the staff. Through the MRC, Trotsky had created a parallel command structure. He immediately dispatched officials known as commissars to every regiment in the garrison, to the railway stations, and to the arms depots. These commissars were young, fanatical Bolsheviks. Their orders were simple. They were to inform the soldiers that no order from the provisional government or the regular military headquarters was to be obeyed unless it was countersigned by the Military Revolutionary Committee. This was a bureaucratic coup d'état. Before a single shot was fired, Trotsky was stripping the government of its authority over the armed forces. He was severing the nerve endings that connected the brain of the state in the Winter Palace to the muscles of the army in the barracks. The Prime Minister, Alexander Kerensky, inadvertently played directly into Trotsky's hands. On October 16th, desperate to remove the rebellious troops from the capital, Kerensky ordered the bulk of the Petrograd garrison to prepare for transfer to the front lines. To the soldiers, this order was a death sentence. It meant leaving the relative comfort of the city for the freezing, mud-filled trenches of the Autumn War. The soldiers immediately held meetings and declared that the order was politically motivated. They claimed Kerensky was trying to dump them at the front to be slaughtered so he could dismantle the revolution at home. The Military Revolutionary Committee stepped in as the protector of the soldiers. On October 21st, the MRC held a conference of regimental committees. Trotsky addressed the men. He told them that the transfer to the front was a counter-revolutionary plot. The conference passed a resolution declaring their full support for the MRC. Effectively, the garrison of Petrograd had just mutinied. However, there was one critical stronghold that the Bolsheviks did not yet control, the Peter and Paul fortress. The Peter and Paul fortress was the strategic key to the city. It sat on an island in the Neva River, directly opposite the Winter Palace. Its heavy cannons overlooked the government buildings. More importantly, its arsenal contained 100,000 rifles. If those weapons remained in the hands of the government, or if the fortress cannons fired on the Bolshevik headquarters at Smolny, the revolution could be crushed. The fortress was commanded by an officer loyal to the provisional government. He refused to recognize the authority of the Bolshevik commissars. He threatened to arrest anyone who tried to interfere with his command. On October 23rd, the tension at the Smolny Institute was palpable. The Bolshevik military leaders, including Vladimir Antonov-Ovsienko, argued that they had to storm the fortress immediately. They began drawing up plans for a bloody amphibious assault across the river. They prepared to send in the Red Guard to take the citadel by force. Trotsky intervened. He argued that an assault would signal the start of a civil war too early. He believed that the garrison inside the fortress, which consisted largely of a bicycle battalion, was wavering and confused. Trotsky stated that he would take the fortress with words alone. In the early afternoon of October 23rd, Leon Trotsky drove to the Peter and Paul fortress. He was unaccompanied by an armed guard. He walked up to the gates and demanded entry. The sentries, recognizing the famous chairman of the Soviet, let him pass. Inside the courtyard, the soldiers of the bicycle battalion gathered. They were skeptical. They had been told by their officers that the Bolsheviks were German agents and looters. Trotsky climbed onto a wooden table in the center of the yard. He spoke to them as fellow soldiers. He explained the political situation and told them that the Kerensky government was serving the interests of the British and French bankers. He told them that the Soviet was the only power that would end the war and give land to the peasants. He asked them a simple question: whose side were they on? Were they with the officers who wanted to send them to the front, or were they with the workers of Petrograd? The effect was instantaneous. The soldiers of the bicycle battalion began to cheer. They voted, right there in the courtyard, to pledge their allegiance to the Military Revolutionary Committee. The commandant of the fortress, realizing he had lost his men, surrendered his authority. Trotsky walked out of the fortress having secured 100,000 rifles and the most formidable artillery position in the city without a single drop of blood being spilled. He telephoned the Smolny Institute to tell them the assault was unnecessary. The fortress was theirs. By the evening of October 23rd, the trap was set. The provisional government was still technically in power. The ministers were sitting in their offices, issuing memorandums, the theatres were open, the trams were running. But it was a phantom government. The Military Revolutionary Committee had quietly seized control of the armed power of the capital. The master key had been turned. All that remained was for the Bolsheviks to physically walk in and take possession of the state. Kerensky, finally realizing the strangulation hold that was tightening around him, decided to lash out. In the early hours of October 24th, he ordered a detachment of loyal military cadets, known as junkers, to seize the printing press of the Bolshevik newspaper. He ordered the arrest of the Military Revolutionary Committee. He ordered the telephone lines to the Smolny Institute to be cut. It was a feeble counterattack, but it gave Trotsky exactly what he needed: a pretext. At the Smolny Institute, when the news arrived the Junkers had smashed the printing presses, Trotsky did not declare a coup. He declared that the counter-revolution had begun. He announced that the government was attacking the Soviet and that it was their duty to defend the democratic rights of the people. He issued Order No. 1 to the garrison. It instructed the regiments to prepare for combat readiness. He ordered the cruiser Aurora, which was undergoing repairs in the shipyards, to steam up the Neva River and anchor opposite the Winter Palace. The genius of Trotsky's plan was that to the average soldier and worker, it did not look like an insurrection. It looked like a police action to protect the Soviet from a right-wing attack. By the time the citizens of Petrograd realized what was happening, the Bolsheviks would already be the government. The invisible coup was about to begin. Part 3. The City That Didn't Wake Up. On the morning of October 24, 1917, the city of Petrograd woke up to a grey, damp Tuesday. To the casual observer walking down the Nevsky Prospect, there was little sign that the world was about to change. The trams were clattering along their tracks, the shops were open for business, although the queues for bread were longer than usual. The banks were trading, and the telephone exchange was connecting calls. However, beneath this veneer of normality, a silent war was being fought for the control of the city's nervous system. Following Kerensky's clumsy attempt to shut down the Bolshevik newspapers, the Military Revolutionary Committee moved from a defensive posture to an offensive one. But it was an offensive unlike any revolution the world had ever seen. There were no barricades made of cobblestones, there were no mobs singing revolutionary anthems, there was no chaotic gunfire. Instead, small detachments of Red Guards and sailors moved through the city with the quiet purpose of shift workers going to a factory. They were following a precise schedule drawn up by the mathematicians of the coup at the Smolny Institute. Their targets were the technical infrastructure of the modern state. They targeted the electric power station, the main post office, the central telephone exchange, the state bank, and the railway stations. The takeover of the central telegraph office was typical of the day's events. A detachment of the Kexholm regiment, loyal to the Bolsheviks, arrived at the building's entrance. The guards on duty were from a unit loyal to the provisional government. The Bolshevik officer did not draw his weapon. He simply walked up to the sentries and informed them that his unit was relieving them of duty. The government guards, bored, cold, and demoralized, were happy to be relieved. They shouldered their rifles and walked away. The Bolsheviks took their places. Inside the building, the telegraph operators continued to send messages, unaware that the men guarding the doors now served a different master. At the state bank, the Bolsheviks surrounded the building with a cordon of sailors. They stood guard, ensuring that no money could be moved without the permission of the Military Revolutionary Committee. The clerks inside continued to stamp forms. One by one, the lights on the government's dashboard went out. The Winter Palace lost its ability to communicate with the army commands at the front. It lost control over the electricity grid. It lost the ability to stop trains entering the city. Yet, life in the bourgeois districts of the capital continued with a surreal indifference. The American journalist John Reed, who was in Petrograd documenting the events for his book 10 Days That Shook the World, wandered through the streets that afternoon. He noted that the gambling clubs were packed with officers drinking champagne. He saw wealthy ladies in fur coats walking their dogs along the canals. In the evening, the opera houses and theatres were full. At the Mariinsky Theatre, the legendary bass Fyodor Chaliapin was performing in Boris Godunov. The audience, dressed in evening gowns and tuxedos, sat in the plush velvet seats, oblivious to the fact that just a few blocks away, armed men were seizing the bridges that connected the city's islands. The bridges were the strategic choke points of Petrograd. Whoever controlled the bridges controlled the flow of troops. In the late afternoon, the provisional government ordered the bridges to be raised to cut off the working-class districts from the city centre. At the Nikolaevsky Bridge, a standoff occurred. The government cadets began to raise the drawbridge. A group of Bolshevik sailors from the cruiser Aurora, which had moved into the river, came ashore. They argued with the cadets, threatening them with the wrath of the revolutionary sailors. The cadets, terrified by the reputation of the Aurora crew, abandoned their posts and fled. The sailors lowered the bridge. The artery remained open. By the early hours of Wednesday, October 25th, the stranglehold was complete. The Bolsheviks controlled almost every strategic point in the city except for the Winter Palace itself. Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky had spent the night in the Winter Palace, frantically trying to govern a city that no longer listened to him. He sat in the library, making telephone calls to the frontline generals, begging for loyal troops to be sent to the capital. The generals, remembering the Kornilov affair, were evasive. They promised help that never arrived. At around 9 o'clock in the morning on October 25th, Kerensky looked out of the palace window. He saw the Nikolaevsky Bridge. It was swarming with sailors. He saw the red flag flying from the end of the bridge. Kerensky realized the terrifying truth. He was trapped. The railway stations were closed to him. The telephone lines were tapped. The Bolsheviks were slowly tightening the noose around the palace. He decided that his only hope was to escape the city and drive to the front lines personally to find an army that would fight. But there was a humiliating problem. The Prime Minister of Russia did not have a car. The Bolsheviks had disabled the ignitions of the government limousine fleet. Desperate, Kerensky's aides called the American embassy and begged for a vehicle. The Americans lent them a Renault car flying the Stars and Stripes. The escape of Alexander Kerensky was a pathetic end to his rule. The Renault was not big enough for his entourage, so they commandeered a second car. As the two vehicles sped out of the palace courtyard, they realized they didn't have enough fuel. They had to stop at a calmer part of the city to beg for gasoline. Kerensky, sitting in the back of the American car, was recognized by a sentry as they passed a checkpoint. The sentry saluted. Kerensky saluted back. The cars sped out of the city, heading toward Gatchina. The man who had styled himself as the savior of Russia, the persuader-in-chief, had fled his capital in a borrowed car under a foreign flag, leaving his ministers behind to face the consequences. Back at the Smolny Institute, Vladimir Lenin had finally arrived. He had walked through the city from his safe house the previous night, still wearing his wig and with a bandage wrapped around his face as a disguise. He was nearly arrested by a government patrol, but managed to bluff his way through. When he arrived at Smolny, he was unrecognizable. He went to the room where the Bolsheviks were meeting. He removed his wig and wiped the makeup from his face. He demanded to know why the Winter Palace had not yet been taken. He was furious at the delay. He told Trotsky and the military commanders that they were moving too slowly. He wanted the government arrested before the Congress of Soviets opened that evening. At 10 o'clock in the morning on October 25th, the Military Revolutionary Committee issued a proclamation written by Lenin. It was broadcast over the captured telegraph network. It read, "To the citizens of Russia, the provisional government has been deposed. State power has passed into the hands of the organ of the Petrograd Soviet. The cause for which the people have fought is secured." It was a brilliant piece of political fiction. The provisional government had not yet been deposed. The ministers were still sitting in the Winter Palace holding a cabinet meeting, but Lenin knew that in a revolution, perception is reality. By announcing the victory before it happened, he made the government look like a relic of the past. The city of Petrograd continued to function as if nothing had happened. The banks opened their doors, the trams continued to run. A housekeeper who walked to the market that morning later recalled that the only sign of the Great October Revolution was that there were slightly more soldiers on the street corners than usual. The coup had been so silent, so methodical, that the city hadn't even woken up to realize it had been conquered. However, one building remained defiant. The Winter Palace, the massive crimson and white residence of the Tsars, stood like an island in the center of the Bolshevik Sea. Inside, the remaining ministers of the provisional government waited for the help that Kerensky had promised them. They sat around the table in the malachite room, chain-smoking, doodling on notepads, and watching the hands of the clock move slowly toward their doom. Outside the gates, the Red Guards were gathering. The final act of the drama was about to begin. Part 4. The Siege of the Winter Palace. By the evening of October 25th, the Winter Palace stood as the final lonely island of the provisional government. This colossal Baroque structure, with its 1,000 rooms and seemingly endless facade facing the Neva River, was the physical embodiment of the Russian state. For centuries, it had been the home of the Tsars. Now, it was the prison of their successors. Inside the palace, the situation was characterized by a surreal bureaucratic paralysis. With Prime Minister Kerensky having fled the city that morning in search of an army that did not exist, the leadership of the government fell to Alexander Konovalov, the Minister of Trade and Industry. He and the remaining cabinet ministers gathered in the malachite room. This chamber was a masterpiece of imperial design, featuring massive columns of green malachite, golden doors and crimson drapery. It overlooked the Neva River and the Peter and Paul fortress beyond. The ministers sat around a long table covered in green baize. They maintained the rituals of government to the bitter end. They drafted proclamations and decrees, debating the wording of legal documents that would never be printed. They chain-smoked incessantly. Observers later recalled that the air in the room was thick with blue smoke, and the ashtrays were overflowing with thousands of cigarette butts. They made telephone calls to the city Duma and the military headquarters, pleading for reinforcements, but the voice on the other end of the line was becoming increasingly evasive. The defense of the palace was a military farce. In theory, the building was a fortress. In reality, it was a trap. The garrison tasked with protecting the government was a motley collection of roughly 3,000 troops, few of whom had any desire to die for the ministers sitting upstairs. The core of the defense consisted of several companies of Junkers. These were cadets from the military engineering and artillery schools. Most of them were teenagers, patriotic boys from middle-class families who had been sent to the palace with no clear orders and no food. They wandered the courtyards, confused and frightened, stacking firewood into makeshift barricades. Alongside the Junkers stood the most unusual unit in the Russian army, the Women's Battalion of Death. This was the 2nd Petrograd Women's Battalion, a unit formed earlier in the year to shame the war-weary men into fighting. They were disciplined and motivated, but they were numerically insignificant. About 130 of these women were stationed in the palace, digging defensive positions in the piles of wood near the main gates. There was also a small detachment of Cossacks and a few veterans with the Cross of St. George. But as the evening wore on, the morale of these troops began to disintegrate. The palace had no food supplies. The cooks had abandoned their kitchens earlier in the day. The defenders were hungry, cold, and bored. They watched the Red Guard tightening the ring around the building. They saw the armored cars of the Bolsheviks patrolling the square. They realized they were fighting for a lost cause. The Cossacks were the first to leave. They declared that they were willing to fight the Bolsheviks, but they refused to fight alongside women and children, referring to the Battalion of Death and the teenage cadets. They negotiated a safe passage with the besiegers and marched out of the palace gates, leaving the government even more exposed. Opposing this fragile garrison was the Military Revolutionary Committee. The Bolsheviks had surrounded the palace with a massive ring of soldiers, sailors, and Red Guards. They controlled the Peter and Paul fortress across the river, its cannons trained on the palace windows. They controlled the cruiser Aurora, anchored in the river. However, the Bolshevik leadership was hesitant to unleash a full-scale assault. Vladimir Lenin from his hideout at Smolny was furious. He bombarded the commanders, Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko and Nikolai Podvoisky, with messages demanding the capture of the palace immediately. He wanted the government arrested before the Congress of Soviets opened that night. But the commanders on the ground were cautious. They feared that the palace was heavily defended. They overestimated the strength of the Junkers. They wanted to avoid a bloodbath that might damage the historic building or turn public opinion against them. They preferred to win by psychological warfare. At 6:30 in the evening, the Bolsheviks sent an ultimatum. Two cyclists carrying a white flag approached the General Staff building across the square. They delivered a message demanding the unconditional surrender of the provisional government by 7:10 p.m. If the ministers refused, the cruiser Aurora and the fortress would open fire. The ministers in the Malachite room read the ultimatum. They decided to reject it. They believed, with a desperate, delusional hope, that Kerensky was about to return with loyal troops at any moment. They turned off the lights in the Malachite room to avoid presenting targets for snipers and moved to a darkened private dining room to eat a meager dinner of soup and bread. The deadline passed. Nothing happened. The Bolsheviks, disorganized and plagued by faulty communications, were not ready to fire. The signal to attack was supposed to be a red lantern raised on the flagpole of the Peter and Paul fortress. But at the critical moment, the Bolshevik commissar in the fortress realized he did not have a red lantern. He sent a soldier running into the city to find one. The soldier returned with a lantern that was not red, but purple. When they tried to hoist it, it was difficult to see against the murky night sky. Finally, at 9:40 p.m., the signal was given. On board the cruiser Aurora, the order was shouted. The forward 6-inch gun roared. The blast shattered the silence of Petrograd. The shockwave broke windows in the nearby buildings, but the Aurora fired only a single shell, and it was a blank. The psychological impact of that blank shell was more devastating than high explosive. The roar of the naval gun signaled to the defenders inside the palace that they were completely outgunned. The terrifying sound reverberated through the vast halls, shaking the crystal chandeliers. To the ministers huddled in the dark, it sounded like the end of the world. Following the shot from the Aurora, the guns of the Peter and Paul fortress opened fire with live ammunition. Most of the shells flew wide, splashing harmlessly into the Neva River or exploding in the air. Only 2 or 3 shells actually hit the palace, chipping the plasterwork and breaking windows, but causing no structural damage. The barrage was mostly noise, but it broke the will of the remaining defenders. The Junkers began to abandon their posts. A lieutenant approached the ministers and informed them that there were no officers left to command the defense. The women's battalion, isolated in one of the wings of the palace, became hysterical after being disarmed by a group of infiltrating sailors. They were locked in a room for their own safety, terrified of sexual violence at the hands of the mob. By midnight, the siege had evolved into something bizarre. Instead of a disciplined military assault, it was a slow, chaotic infiltration. The Winter Palace was simply too large to guard. It had hundreds of doors, servants' entrances, and basement windows. The defenders had neglected to lock many of them. Curious sailors and Red Guards began to slip into the palace. They climbed through open windows. They walked in through the unlocked back doors near the Hermitage Museum. They drifted into the building in small groups, weapons in hand, looking around with wide eyes at the opulence of the imperial residence. For a time, a strange game of cat and mouse played out in the miles of corridors. The invaders would bump into a group of Junkers. Sometimes they would shoot at each other, but more often, the Junkers would simply confiscate the intruders' weapons and tell them to leave. A few minutes later, another group of Bolsheviks would arrive, and this time they would disarm the Junkers. The palace was filled with wandering groups of armed men who didn't know the layout, getting lost among the tapestries and the marble statues. The American journalist John Reed, along with a few other foreign correspondents, managed to walk right into the palace during this confusion. He described the scene of the Junkers surrendering, piling their rifles on the floor and walking away, relieved that their ordeal was over. He saw the Red Guards staring at the portraits of the Tsars, touching the silk curtains, awestruck by the wealth they were conquering. By 2 o'clock in the morning on October 26th, the defense had evaporated completely. The palace was swarming with revolutionary troops. The noise of boots and shouting grew louder, echoing up the grand staircases. The ministers of the provisional government were back in the Malachite room. They heard the approaching storm. The sounds of fighting, shots, screams, the smashing of wood were getting closer. They could hear footsteps in the corridor outside. Alexander Konovalov, the acting head of the government, sat at the head of the table. He looked at his colleagues. He stubbed out his cigarette. He said quietly, "The only thing left to do is to sit down at the table and wait." They sat in silence. They expected to be lynched. They knew the hatred that the mob felt for the bourgeois ministers. Suddenly, the double doors of the Malachite room were kicked open. A mob of soldiers, sailors, and Red Guards burst into the room. They were dirty, smelling of sweat and gunpowder, their eyes wild with adrenaline. At the head of the group was Vladimir Antonov Ovsienko. Antonov Ovsienko was an unlikely figure to lead the final charge of the revolution. He was a small, slight man with long, greasy hair that fell over his face. He wore a wide-brimmed felt hat and round spectacles that were sliding down his nose. He looked more like a bohemian artist or a distracted student than a military commander. He stood in the doorway, trying to look authoritative. He pointed his finger at the group of men sitting around the green table. He shouted, "In the name of the Military Revolutionary Committee, I declare you under arrest." Konovalov stood up. He maintained his dignity to the last. He replied formally, "The members of the provisional government submit to force." The room erupted into chaos. The soldiers behind Antonov Ovsienko wanted to bayonet the ministers right there and then. They shouted that these men were bloodsuckers and traitors. Antonov Ovsienko had to physically stand in front of the prisoners, shielding them with his own small body. He shouted at his own men, ordering them to maintain revolutionary discipline. He promised that the ministers would face a people's court, not a lynching. The ministers were searched. They were ordered to put on their coats. They were led out of the Malachite room, down the grand staircase, and out into the cold night air of the palace embankment. The scene outside was bedlam. Thousands of looters were already picking through the lower levels of the palace. The Red Guards were breaking into the imperial wine cellars, smashing bottles of vintage champagne or drinking them straight from the neck. It would take weeks for the Bolsheviks to regain control of the palace wine stores, eventually forcing them to pump the wine out into the river to stop the city-wide drunkenness. The column of prisoners was marched across the Trotsky Bridge toward the Peter and Paul fortress. As they walked, the crowds jeered and spat at them. A passing car slowed down, and the driver shouted, "Throw them in the river!" It was a terrifying walk, but they survived. The heavy oak gates of the fortress slammed shut behind them. The ministers were led to the damp, stone cells of the Trubetskoy Bastion, the same cells that had once held Alexander Ulyanov, Lenin's brother, and Leon Trotsky. The wheel of history had turned a full circle. Back at the Winter Palace, the looting continued, but the political reality was settled. The siege was over. The house of the Tsars was in the hands of the people. The house of ghosts, as the terrified ministers had seemed in those final hours, was finally empty. What is remarkable about the fall of the Winter Palace was how anticlimactic it felt to those who were there. There was no heroic last stand or great speech. The provisional government ran out of energy, out of friends, and out of time. It was a regime that died of exhaustion, pushed over by a gentle shout from history. While the Winter Palace was falling, a far more significant battle was taking place a few miles away at the Smolny Institute. There, the political war for the soul of the revolution was reaching its climax. The guns had done their work. Now it was time for the words that would define the next 70 years of Russian history. Part 5. Into the dustbin of history. While the Red Guards were wandering the corridors of the Winter Palace, the political fate of the revolution was being decided in the assembly hall of the Smolny Institute. The Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets had convened late in the evening of October 25th. The hall, a vast neoclassical ballroom with white columns, was packed to suffocation. The atmosphere was a sensory assault. The air was thick with the blue smoke of cheap tobacco, the smell of wet wool coats, and the unwashed bodies of 650 delegates. These were men who had travelled from every corner of the Russian Empire, soldiers from the trenches in grey tunics, sailors in black peacoats, and workers in cloth caps. They sat on benches, on window ledges, and on the floor, rifles propped between their knees. The political composition of the Congress was a reflection of the radicalized mood of the country. The Bolsheviks controlled roughly 300 seats, the largest single bloc. Their allies, the left socialist revolutionaries, held another large faction. The moderate socialists, the Mensheviks, and the right socialist revolutionaries found themselves in the minority. The proceedings began in chaos. The sound of artillery fire from the Peter and Paul fortress could be heard in the distance, a booming reminder that the insurrection was still ongoing. The moderate socialists were furious. They realized that the Bolsheviks had launched the coup specifically to present the Congress with a fait accompli. They were being asked to rubber stamp a seizure of power that had already happened. Julius Martov, the leader of the Menshevik internationalists and Lenin's old friend turned enemy, took the podium. Martov was a sick man, his voice hoarse from tuberculosis. He pleaded for a peaceful solution. He proposed the formation of a united democratic government that would include all socialist parties, not just the Bolsheviks. He warned that a purely Bolshevik government would lead to civil war. For a brief moment, the hall wavered. The soldiers and workers wanted unity. They cheered Martov's proposal. Even many Bolshevik delegates seemed willing to compromise. But then, the hardline Mensheviks and right socialist revolutionaries made a fatal tactical error. Instead of staying to fight for Martov's compromise, they decided to walk out. One by one, the moderate leaders stood up and denounced the Bolsheviks as usurpers and criminals. They declared that they would not participate in this conspiracy. They announced that they were leaving the Congress to march to the Winter Palace to die with the provisional government. As the moderates filed out of the hall, they were met with jeers and whistles from the Bolshevik soldiers. This walkout was a gift to the Bolsheviks. It removed the only opposition that could have forced a compromise. By leaving the hall, the moderates surrendered the legitimacy of the Soviet entirely to Lenin and Trotsky. Leon Trotsky seized the moment. He stood at the podium, his face pale with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with triumph. He watched the backs of his retreating enemies and delivered the most famous insult in the history of revolutionary politics. He shouted after them, "You are miserable bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, into the dustbin of history." With the opposition gone, the Congress belonged to the Bolsheviks. But the man who had orchestrated the entire event was still missing. Vladimir Lenin had spent the evening pacing in a small side room at Smolny. He was waiting for news of the Winter Palace. He refused to appear before the Congress until the provisional government was officially arrested. He did not want to announce a victory that was not yet complete. At roughly 3 in the morning, on October 26th, the news finally arrived. A messenger brought word that the Winter Palace had fallen and the ministers were in the Peter and Paul fortress. Lenin prepared to make his entrance. He had finally removed his wig and wiped the grease paint from his face. He walked into the great hall. The reaction was seismic. The journalist John Reed described the scene. As Lenin stepped onto the podium, the entire hall rose as one man. A roar of applause erupted that lasted for several minutes. Men threw their caps in the air. They wept. They sang the Internationale. Lenin stood there, gripping the edge of the reading stand. He waited for the noise to subside. Rather than appearing as a conquering hero, he looked like a tired bureaucrat. He was short, stocky, and balding, with trousers that were too long for him. But when he spoke, the room hung on every syllable. He did not waste time with rhetoric. He looked at the crowd and said simply, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." He read out 2 decrees that he had drafted on a notepad. They were the 2 promises that would secure the survival of his new regime. The first was the Decree on Peace. It proposed an immediate armistice on all fronts and the start of negotiations for a peace without annexations or indemnities. To the soldiers in the hall, this was salvation. It meant they would not have to die in the freezing mud of Galicia. The second was the Decree on Land. It was brutal in its simplicity. It abolished private property in land forever. It declared that all the estates of the nobility, the church, and the monasteries were confiscated without compensation and handed over to the peasant committees. With this decree, Lenin effectively sanctioned what was already happening in the countryside, the great peasant land grab. He bought the loyalty of the peasantry with the stroke of a pen. He knew that no force on earth could take the land back from the peasants once they had seized it. The Congress voted to approve the decrees unanimously. The cheering was deafening. A soldier standing near John Reed turned to him, his face streaming with tears, and said, "The war is ended." But the war was not ended, it had just changed shape. As the delegates spilled out of the Smolny Institute into the cold dawn of October 26, they believed they had won, and the revolution was over. They did not know that they were standing on the precipice of a catastrophe that would dwarf the World War. The seizure of power had been deceptively easy. The Bolsheviks had taken Petrograd with hardly a fight, but taking a city is not the same as ruling an empire. Against the new Bolshevik government stood the entire established order of the world. The generals of the army were already gathering their forces in the south to march on the capital. The Cossacks were sharpening their sabers on the Don. The foreign powers, Britain, France, America, and Japan, were preparing to land troops to crush the communist contagion before it could spread. Even within Russia, the civil service went on strike. The bank clerks refused to release funds. The telegraph operators refused to send Bolshevik messages. The railway union threatened to cut off food supplies. Lenin knew this. As he left the podium that morning, he was under no illusions. He knew that the easy part was over. The Red Guard had seized the Winter Palace, but to keep it, they would have to fight a civil war that would tear Russia apart for 5 years and cost 10 million lives. The Soviet century had begun. The sun rose over Petrograd, illuminating a city that was still the same grey, wet capital of the Tsars, but which was now the headquarters of a new world. The experiment had begun. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.